In 1971, Plymouth produced what would become not just the rarest muscle car in American automotive history, but arguably one of the most valuable collector vehicles ever to roll off a Detroit assembly line. The 1971 Hemi'Cuda Convertible represents the absolute pinnacle of the muscle car era. And when you understand that only 12 of these magnificent machines were built for the entire world, with just 7 delivered to customers here in the United States, you begin to comprehend why one of them hammered for $3.5 million at the Mecum Auctions Seattle event in June of 2014. And one of the things that makes this story so fascinating is that these cars were never intended to be rare. Plymouth wasn't trying to create some sort of limited edition collector's piece that would appreciate in value over the decades. No, these were meant to be mass-produced performance machines, part of Plymouth's aggressive E-body Barracuda lineup that had been completely redesigned just the year before. The fact that only 7 U.S. delivered examples exist today is the result of a perfect storm of economics, politics, and changing social attitudes that would effectively kill the muscle car era almost overnight. Now, when we talk about why production was so incredibly limited, we have to understand the context of what was happening in the American automotive landscape at that time. The base price for a 1971 Cuda convertible was $3,412, which was already substantial for the era. But then, if you wanted that legendary 426 cubic inch Hemi engine under the hood, you had to check option code E74 on the order form, and that added another $883.90 to the price. We're talking about a total investment that would be equivalent to well over $50,000 in today's money, and that's before we even discuss insurance costs. And speaking of insurance, this is where things got really interesting, because by 1971, insurance companies had caught on to what was happening with these high-horsepower muscle cars. Young drivers were wrapping them around telephone poles at alarming rates, and the insurance industry responded by making it prohibitively expensive to insure a Hemi-powered anything, let alone a convertible Hemi'Cuda. The insurance premiums for a 20-year-old driver trying to insure one of these beasts could easily exceed the monthly car payment. So you had this situation where Plymouth had created this absolutely magnificent machine, but the people who wanted to buy it simply couldn't afford to insure it. But there was more to the story than just economics. The social and political climate was changing rapidly. Environmental concerns were beginning to take center stage, and the very idea of a car with 425 gross horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque sucking down premium gasoline at an alarming rate was becoming increasingly unfashionable. The forces of political correctness, as they were beginning to be called, were inveighing against exactly the kind of wretched excess that a Hemi'Cuda convertible represented. By 1972, the Hemi engine would be gone entirely, and convertible Barracudas would be discontinued as well, making 1971 the final year for both. Now, before we dive deeper into the story of these 7 American cars, let's talk about what made the 1971 Cuda visually distinct from the 1970 model. For the E-body Barracuda line's second year, Plymouth stylists gave the front end a complete makeover. Where the 1970 model had featured dual headlights, the 71 received a dramatic quad headlight arrangement set behind what enthusiasts affectionately call the cheese grater grille. This wasn't just a minor refresh. It was a complete redesign of the front fascia that gave the car a much more aggressive, almost shark-like appearance. And one of the most distinctive features added for 1971 were these simulated louvers, or gills, as they're commonly called, that were applied to the front fenders. These gills were only found on Cuda models, not on the standard Barracudas or Grand Coupes, and they added a level of visual drama that really set the Cuda apart. The stylists back then had to keep busy between model years, and they dreamed up these decorative elements to add what we might call bling today, though that word hadn't yet entered the English language in 1971. At the rear, the changes were more subtle. The tail panel retained the same basic shape as the 1970 model, though the tail lights and backup lights themselves were redesigned ever so slightly, just enough to constitute a change and give dealers something to talk about when 1971 models arrived in showrooms. And for Hemi-powered cars, Plymouth offered those enormous billboard decals that began on the door with the word Hemi in massive letters, then extended back over almost the entire quarter panel. These weren't subtle cars. When you ordered a Hemi'Cuda with the billboard stripes, designated as option code V6X, you were making a statement that couldn't be ignored. Now, when we talk about the 7 US-delivered 1971 Hemi'Cuda convertibles with 4-speed manual transmissions, we're discussing cars that have achieved almost mythical status among collectors. Each one has been documented, authenticated, and tracked through the decades by experts like Galen Govier, who has personally viewed and verified these machines as genuine examples that have been included in the Chrysler registry. The fact that there were also 5 additional cars built for export, or with automatic transmissions, brings the total to 12 worldwide. But it's these 7 American 4-speed cars that represent the absolute holy grail for muscle car collectors. One of these 7 survivors is finished in B5 blue, both inside and out, with a white vinyl top. This particular example has an absolutely fascinating history that reads like a Hollywood screenplay. Built in February of 1971, its first owner, Ronald Ambach, lived in St. Louis, Missouri, and he owned the car only until that fall, accumulating what would be the car's only street miles before selling it to Nick Masciarelli in Ohio. Masciarelli had different plans for the Cuda. He decided to take its stock eliminator drag racing and turned to renowned Detroit area engine builder Tom Tignanelli for a hot Hemi Fiv 8. The quickest way to meet his racing ambitions was to swap the original engine for a fresh race-prepared Tignanelli Hemi. In May of 1973, this blue Hemi'Cuda convertible was sold to John Book and partner John Oliverio in West Virginia, who raced it in East Coast and Mid-Atlantic events during 73 and 74. Its dramatic appearance, complete with gold leaf mountain Mopar identification, is documented in several period photographs. Importantly, this car is the only 71 Hemi'Cuda convertible known to have been delivered with the body-colored elastomeric front bumper cover, making it unique even among these 7 unicorns. Another documented survivor is a snow-white example that was built for export to France. Now, this car technically isn't one of the 7 US-delivered machines, but its story is so remarkable that it deserves mention here. When this white Cuda arrived at the importateur-distributeur in Paris all those years ago, who would have known that decades later it would survive and eventually make its way back to the United States? Because the car was built for the French market, it featured a metric speedometer and odometer calibrated for kilometers, and it had specific Chrysler France data plates attached in the engine bay. The car was fitted with the Torque Flight automatic transmission rather than the 4-speed manual, and it proudly wore those billboard Hemi stripes on each side, proclaiming its potency in big, bold letters. The color combinations among the 12 cars varied, though comprehensive documentation of every single car's original color scheme remains somewhat elusive even today. What we do know is that Plymouth offered its full range of standard and high-impact colors for 1971, including dramatic hues like lemon twist yellow, plum crazy purple, and various shades of blue, green, orange, and white. Each car that survives today has been meticulously restored with attention paid to authenticating its original color combination, build sheet specifications, and factory markings. Now, when we fast forward to June 14, 2014, we arrive at one of the most dramatic moments in muscle car auction history. Mecum Auctions was holding its inaugural Seattle sale at CenturyLink Field Event Center, and Lot S109 was a numbers-matching 1971 Hemi'Cuda convertible with a 4-speed manual transmission. The auction house had promoted this car heavily, knowing they had something truly special, one of those 7 US-delivered examples that collectors dream about. As the car rolled onto the auction block, the room was packed. The bidding started strong and just kept climbing. For 8 minutes, the drama unfolded as bidders competed for the privilege of owning this piece of automotive history. When the hammer finally fell, the sale price was an unprecedented $3,500,000. The crowd erupted. This wasn't just a new record for a '71 Hemi'Cuda Convertible. It was the highest price ever paid for any Mopar muscle car at public auction, and it stood as one of the most expensive American muscle cars ever sold. What made this sale particularly significant was its timing. The muscle car market had experienced a considerable correction following the financial crisis of 2008. A Hemi'Cuda convertible had sold for around $3 million back in 2007, and many industry observers wondered if those astronomical prices had been a bubble. The $3.5 million sale in Seattle sent a clear message. The market for the absolute top-tier muscle cars, particularly these ultra-rare Hemi'Cuda convertibles, remained incredibly strong. It wasn't a fluke. These cars had genuine, sustained value. The current whereabouts and ownership of all 7 U.S. delivered 1971 Hemi'Cuda convertibles with 4-speed transmissions is information that's carefully guarded within the collector car community. These aren't cars that show up at every local car cruise or even major concours events with any regularity. They're investment-grade collector vehicles worth millions of dollars each, and their owners tend to be private collectors who appreciate both their historical significance and their investment value. What we do know is that several of these cars have undergone comprehensive, rotisserie-style restorations by some of the most respected names in the Mopar restoration world. Restorers like Roger Gibson and the team at Legendary Motorcar have brought these machines back to better than showroom condition, with meticulous attention paid to authenticity. This includes correct date-coded engine blocks, proper production markings and paint daubs applied by Hamtramck assembly plant line inspectors, accurate finishing of components down to the bright yellow paint on transmission mounts, and authentication of every detail from the factory. The cars have been featured in various automotive publications over the decades, including Car Collector magazine, and several have appeared in books dedicated to the muscle car era. They occasionally surface at major auction houses like Mecum and RM Auctions, where they're offered with comprehensive documentation including original broadcast sheets, build sheets, continuous ownership histories documented through sequences of titles, restoration photographs, and authentication from recognized experts in the field. Now, before we wrap up this story, we should talk about what made these cars so special from a mechanical standpoint, because it wasn't just their rarity that drove values into the millions. Under that shaker hood, which came standard with the E74 Hemi option, sat the legendary 426 cubic inch street Hemi. This wasn't some detuned economy engine. We're talking about hemispherical combustion chambers, huge valves, massive ports, and impressive dimensions. 4.25 inch bore and 3.75 inch stroke. The engine produced 425 gross horsepower at 5,000 RPM and a massive 490 pound-feet of torque at 4,000 RPM. The engine breathed through 2 Carter AFB 4-barrel carburetors, those beautiful aluminum 4-barrel units that sat atop a cross-ram intake manifold. The compression ratio was 10.2 to 1, and the engine featured dual-point ignition for reliability. When you stomped on the throttle of one of these cars, all that power was channeled through a pistol-grip Hurst-shifted 4-speed manual transmission to a Dana SuperTrack Pack rear axle. The standard final drive ratio was 3.23 to 1, which provided a nice balance between acceleration and highway cruising. The chassis received significant upgrades to handle all this power. Hemi-equipped cars got upgraded suspension components and structural reinforcements to help transfer that tremendous torque to the road. All 4 wheels were fitted with disc brakes, which was essential given the car's performance capability. The front fenders on Hemi cars received special clearance notches to accommodate the F60-15 Goodyear Polyglass GT tires, which had a tread width of 8.25 inches and were mounted on 7-inch wide W21 rally wheels. Inside the trunk, Hemi-powered e-body cars came standard with the W34 collapsible spare tire with an air canister, a mandatory option that allowed for a bit more cargo room given the space constraints created by the Dana rear axle and fuel tank. Other typical options on these highly optioned cars included power steering, power brakes, power windows, center console with horseshoe shifter, tachometer, AM/FM radio, and various interior trim upgrades. As we look back more than 5 decades later, the 1971 Plymouth Hemi'Cuda Convertible stands as perhaps the most perfect crystallization of the American muscle car era's excess and ambition. These cars were built at the absolute peak of the horsepower wars, just before everything changed. Within a year, the Hemi engine would be discontinued. Convertibles would be dropped from the Barracuda lineup. Net horsepower ratings would replace gross ratings, making every engine appear dramatically less powerful on paper. Insurance costs would continue to climb. Emissions regulations would tighten. The OPEC oil embargo would send gas prices soaring and create fuel shortages. The muscle car era would effectively end, and cars like the Hemi'Cuda Convertible would be seen as dinosaurs, gas-guzzling relics of a more innocent time when Americans believed that bigger was always better, and that there would always be cheap, plentiful gasoline to feed these magnificent beasts. Values plummeted through the 1970s. Many of these cars were crashed, parted out, or simply abandoned as their owners moved on to more practical transportation. But then something remarkable happened. As the years passed, collectors began to recognize what had been lost. The muscle car era began to be romanticized, and suddenly people wanted to recapture that feeling of raw, unfiltered American horsepower. Values began to climb. A car that might have sold for $10,000 in the 1980s was worth $100,000 by the 90s. By the early 2000s, the best examples were crossing the $1 million threshold. And by 2014, we saw that $3.5 million sale in Seattle that shocked even seasoned collectors. Today, if you're fortunate enough to see one of these 7 U.S.-delivered 1971 Hemi'Cuda convertibles in person, you're witnessing automotive history of the highest order. These aren't just rare cars. They're rolling time capsules that represent a moment in American culture when excess wasn't just accepted but celebrated, when environmental concerns took a back seat to cubic inches and horsepower, and when you could walk into a Plymouth dealer and order a convertible with an engine that was designed for NASCAR racing. There's nothing politically correct, nothing socially responsible about a Hemi'Cuda convertible. It's wretched excess in a nearly unimaginably limited production package, and that's exactly what makes it so special. The fact that only 7 of these machines were delivered to U.S. customers with 4-speed manual transmissions, and that several of them survive today in documented, authenticated condition, is nothing short of miraculous. Each one that sold new for roughly $4,300 in 1971 is now worth well into the millions, making them some of the best automotive investments ever made, if you were fortunate enough to buy one new and wise enough to hold on to it through all those years when nobody seemed to care. So the next time someone asks you about the rarest American muscle car, you can tell them with absolute confidence. It's the 1971 Plymouth Hemi'Cuda Convertible with a 4-speed manual transmission. 7 U.S. delivered examples, 12 in the entire world. 1 sold for $3.5 million, and every single one of them represents the absolute pinnacle of an era that will never come again.